History remembers King Cedric of Dunstanburgh as the ruthless conqueror of the Northern Highlands. But the royal archives hide a far more dangerous secret. A scentless maid, a desperate disguise, and a single drop of blood that brought an invincible Alpha King to his knees. The year was 1342, and the bitter winter winds, howling off the North Sea, battered the stone walls of Dunstanburgh Castle. Within the lower kitchens, cloaked in the steam of boiling cauldrons and the grease of roasting meats, Beatrice Aristhorpe worked in intentional obscurity. To the head cook, she was simply Beatrice, a quiet, unremarkable human girl who scrubbed the iron kettles until her knuckles bled. To the castle guards, she was a shadow, blending perfectly into the soot-stained masonry of the keep. But Beatrice was not human, and she was certainly not unremarkable. She was an Omega, the last surviving member of the Aristhorpe pack. 5 years prior, a coordinated siege by rival Highland factions had slaughtered her family in their beds. Omegas in this brutal medieval era were not viewed as equals. They were prized commodities, traded like gold, broken for their unique abilities to soothe alpha rage, and locked away as breeding stock to produce the strongest heirs. Beatrice had seen her own aunt chained to a lord's bed, her spirit crushed under the weight of forced submission. When the Aristhorpe estate burned, Beatrice ran. She made a vow to the moon that she would never be enslaved to an alpha's command. To survive, she engaged in a daily, agonizing ritual. Every morning before dawn, in the freezing damp of her servants' quarters, Beatrice took dried wolfsbane, a highly toxic herb to her kind, and burned it into a fine white ash. Mixing this ash with pine resin and river mud, she created a paste that she ruthlessly rubbed into her pulse points, behind her ears, her wrists, and the base of her throat. The wolfsbane burned her skin like acid, suppressing her inner wolf and completely masking her intoxicating omega scent, a fragrance of wild orchids, petrichor, and sweet vanilla. Under the heavy paste, she smelled of nothing but pine sap and kitchen grease. Her wolf wept in the dark recesses of her mind, starved of the moon and stripped of its identity. But the pain meant freedom. This fragile peace held until the day King Cedric claimed Dunstanburgh as his primary fortress. Cedric of the House of Lancaster was a terrifying figure. Standing over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, and piercing, ice-blue eyes that missed nothing, he was an alpha whose mere presence could force lesser wolves to their knees. I was known as the Iron Wolf of the North, a leader who had united the scattered Midland packs through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Yet Cedric was a king without a queen. At 28, his lack of a Luna was destabilizing his reign. The alpha's rage, a violent madness that infects powerful alphas without a mate to anchor their souls, was beginning to fray his edges. His advisors begged him to choose a high-born beta or one of the few heavily guarded omegas from allied territories, but Cedric refused. He was waiting for his fated mate, trusting the moon goddess, even as his sanity slowly began to slip. Beatrice first encountered him during the winter solstice feast. She was tasked with carrying a heavy silver platter of roasted pheasant to the high table. As she approached the dais, a sudden violent jolt of electricity shot up her spine. Her suppressed wolf, dormant for half a decade, suddenly thrashed against its wolfsbane cage, howling in a mix of agony and primal ecstasy. "Mate," The realization hit Beatrice so hard she stumbled, nearly dropping the heavy silver platter. The king, seated just 10 feet away, stiffened. Cedric's head snapped up. His ice-blue eyes scanned the great hall, his nostrils flaring wildly as he tried to catch a scent. He could feel the tether, the unmistakable soul-deep pull of his fated mate. But the crowded hall was a chaotic miasma of roasting meat, mead, smoke, and sweating bodies. Beatrice held her breath, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She kept her eyes glued to the stone floor, stepping backward into the shadows of the tapestry-lined walls. Cedric rose from his heavy oak throne, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in his chest that silenced the entire hall. The musicians stopped playing. The lords and ladies froze. "Who goes there?" Cedric barked, his alpha command lacing the air, heavy enough to crush the lungs of the weak. Beatrice felt the command demanding her submission, begging her knees to hit the floor. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, using the physical pain to fight the magical compulsion. Because her scent was entirely masked by the toxic wolfsbane paste, the king's senses skipped right over her, dismissing her as a human servant of no consequence. Frustrated, Cedric overturned his goblet, sending dark wine spilling across the white linen like blood. "Search the perimeter," he roared to his royal guard. "She is here. I know she is here." Beatrice slipped out through the kitchens, her hands trembling so violently she could barely scrub the pots for the rest of the night. She had found her mate, and he was the most dangerous man in the kingdom. From that night on, she doubled the wolfsbane in her paste, enduring chemical burns on her neck rather than risk discovery. She lived in constant terror, knowing that if the Iron Wolf ever discovered his fated mate was a scullery maid and an Omega who had actively hidden from him, his wrath, or worse, his possessive obsession, would consume her entire existence. 2 months passed, and the atmosphere within Dunstanburgh Castle grew suffocatingly tense. King Cedric's inability to find the mate he had sensed at the solstice feast had driven him to a dark, restless obsession. He prowled the battlements at night in his wolf form, a massive beast of midnight fur, his mournful howls echoing over the crashing sea. To make matters worse, a treasonous plot had been uncovered. A caravan carrying winter provisions and silver to allied packs in the south had been intercepted by Highland rebels. The precision of the ambush meant only one thing: there was a spy inside Dunstanburgh. Lord Percival, the king's calculating and utterly ruthless chief advisor, called an emergency council. Percival was a traditionalist who despised the leniency Cedric showed to the human staff. "My king," Percival's reedy voice echoed in the chamber, loud enough for Beatrice to hear as she scrubbed the flagstones in the adjoining corridor. "The Highland scum knew our exact route. The leak comes from within your own walls. We cannot trust anyone, not the guards, not the lords, and certainly not the servants. Your solution, Percival?" Cedric's voice was weary, lined with the exhaustion of an alpha fighting his own internal madness. "The right of veracity, a blood oath," Percival stated firmly. "We summon the High Priest of the Moon. Every soul residing within Dunstanburgh, from the highest lord to the lowest stable boy, must bleed upon the moonstone altar. The ancient magic will strip away all deceit, all enchantments, and all hidden allegiances. The guilty will burn upon contact. The innocent shall pass." Out in the corridor, Beatrice's blood ran cold. The scrub brush slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly against the stone bucket. A blood oath. It was an ancient, highly dangerous form of lichen magic. Beatrice knew of it from her father's old scrolls. The moonstone did not merely detect lies about treason. It forcibly stripped away all falsehoods from a person's aura. It shattered glamour magic, healed temporary physical disguises, and most terrifyingly, instantly neutralized any chemical or botanical suppressants in the bloodstream. If Beatrice bled upon that altar, the magic would instantly purge the wolfsbane from her system. Her true omega scent would explode into the room, and she would be standing mere inches from King Cedric. "Let it be done," Cedric commanded, his voice cold and resolute. "Seal the castle gates. No one leaves until every drop of blood is accounted for." Panic seized Beatrice. She abandoned her bucket and bolted down the servants' stairwell. She had to escape. The punishment for treason was death, but to Beatrice, being chained as an alpha's breeding mate was a fate worse than the executioner's block. She rushed to the southern postern gate, a small wooden door used for kitchen refuse. It was her only chance. She threw her weight against the heavy iron latch, but it was barred from the outside. "Looking for a way out, little bird?" Beatrice spun around, her back hitting the rough wood. Stepping out of the shadows was Arthur, the captain of the guard. He was a broad-shouldered beta who had often shown Beatrice kindness in the kitchens, sneaking her extra bread when the cook wasn't looking. "Arthur, please," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "My mother is deeply ill in the village. I just received word. I must go to her." Arthur's eyes softened with genuine pity, but he shook his head, resting a heavy hand on the pommel of his sword. "I cannot let you pass, Beatrice. The king's orders are absolute. Any who attempt to flee the keep before the blood oath are to be considered spies and executed on sight. I am saving your life by keeping you here." "You don't understand." A tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the soot on her cheek. "I will die if I stay. It's just a prick off a silver dagger, lass. If you haven't sold our secrets to the Highlanders, you have nothing to fear," Arthur said gently, misinterpreting her terror. He stepped forward, gently but firmly grasping her arm. "Come. The ceremony is beginning in the Great Hall. I will walk with you to ensure you are safe." Trapped. She was utterly trapped. Arthur escorted her to the Great Hall, which had been transformed into a theatre of judgment. The long dining tables had been removed. In the center of the room stood an ancient pedestal of black iron, upon which rested the moonstone, a massive raw crystal that pulsed with a faint, ethereal silver light. Beside it stood the high priest in deep violet robes, holding a ceremonial silver dagger and a golden chalice. King Cedric sat upon his throne, leaning heavily on one fist, his eyes dark and brooding as he watched the proceedings. The heavy doors were barred, flanked by 24 armored lichen guards. The line of inhabitants stretched around the perimeter of the hall. Beatrice was forced into the queue among the weeping scullery maids and anxious stable hands. Time seemed to warp, slowing to an agonizing crawl as she watched person after person step up to the altar. Slice, drip, flash. A lord stepped up, his wrist slashed. The blood hit the stone. A soft white light pulsed, innocent. He stepped away, clutching his arm. Slice, drip, flash. A kitchen boy, innocent. Then came a merchant who had been staying in the guest quarters. As his blood struck the moonstone, the crystal turned a violent, sickening crimson. The stone hissed, emitting black smoke. The merchant screamed, falling to his knees as the magic burned him for his treachery. "Take him to the dungeons," Cedric ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. Guards immediately dragged the sobbing man away. The line moved forward. 10 people ahead of Beatrice. 8. 5. Her heart beat so frantically, she feared it would shatter her ribs. She could feel the wolfsbane paste itching violently on her neck, as if the magic in the room was already trying to tear it away. Her suppressed wolf whimpered, pressing against the forefront of her mind, sensing the overwhelming proximity of its mate. 3 people. 2, 1. "Next," the high priest intoned. Arthur gently nudged Beatrice from behind. "Go on, lass. It will be over in a second." Beatrice stepped up to the altar. Her legs felt like lead. She kept her head bowed, staring at the glowing, hypnotic surface of the moonstone. "Sleeve up," the priest ordered. With a shaking hand, Beatrice rolled up the coarse linen sleeve of her tunic, exposing her pale, thin wrist. She didn't dare look up at the throne, but she could feel the crushing weight of Cedric's alpha aura bearing down on the room. The priest took her hand. The silver blade was ice cold. Slice. Beatrice gasped at the sharp sting. A bead of dark crimson blood welled up on her wrist. The priest guided her hand over the moonstone. The blood hung in the air for a fraction of a second, reflecting the torchlight, before landing squarely on the crystal. For a second, nothing happened. Then the moonstone erupted, but it did not flash white for innocence, nor red for treason. It exploded in a blinding, brilliant column of pure, iridescent silver light that shot toward the vaulted ceiling. A shock wave of raw magic blasted through the hall. Beatrice screamed as a searing heat ripped through her veins. The magic hunted down the wolfsbane in her system, incinerating the toxin in a heartbeat. The dried paste behind her ears and on her throat instantly turned to dust and blew away. The dam broke. Her inner wolf, caged for 5 years, roared to the surface with earth-shattering force. In the span of a single breath, the stench of kitchen grease and pine sap vanished. Replacing it was a scent so potent, so overwhelmingly pure, that it brought the armed guards in the room to their knees. The heavy, intoxicating fragrance of wild orchids, deep petrichor, and sweet vanilla flooded the great hall like a tidal wave. Total silence fell over the room. The air grew so thick with omega pheromones that the beta lords gasped for breath. On the dais, a chair shattered into 100 pieces. Beatrice snapped her head up. King Cedric had risen so fast, the heavy oak chair beneath him had splintered. His ice-blue eyes were no longer human. They were glowing, brilliant, predatory gold. His chest heaved, his fangs fully descended, and the alpha command rolling off him was a physical weight that cracked the stone floor beneath his boots. He vaulted over the high table, landing in the center of the hall with a deafening thud. He didn't look at the high priest. He didn't look at the glowing stone. His golden eyes locked onto Beatrice, predatory, wild, and wholly consumed by an obsession that had finally found its target. A low, vibrating growl echoed through the silent hall, shaking the very dust from the rafters. "Mine." The single, guttural word shattered the frozen silence of the great hall. King Cedric moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, closing the distance between the dais and the moonstone altar in 3 massive strides. The armored Lycan guards, seasoned warriors, who had fought in the bloodiest Highland campaigns, instinctively backed away, unable to withstand the suffocating, possessive aura radiating from their alpha. Beatrice stumbled backward, her spine hitting the cold iron of the pedestal. The sheer force of the king's unblinking golden eyes paralyzed her. The air crackled with raw, untamed magic. Every instinct in her omega biology screamed at her to bare her throat, to submit to the overwhelming power of her fated mate, but the trauma of her past fueled a desperate rebellion. "Stay back," Beatrice choked out, her voice trembling, but laced with a defiance that sent a shockwave through the gathered nobility. A collective gasp echoed from the lords and ladies. A scullery maid daring to command the Iron Wolf? It was a death sentence. Cedric halted just inches from her. His massive chest heaved, his breathing ragged. The golden glow in his eyes warred with the ice blue of his human consciousness. He reached out a scarred, trembling hand, stopping just short of touching her soot-stained cheek. He was inhaling her scent, the intoxicating wild orchids and vanilla, as if it were oxygen, and he had been drowning for 28 years. "You hid from me." Cedric's voice was a low rumble, vibrating with a terrifying mix of betrayal, awe, and desperate relief. "My queen has been scrubbing my floors, burning her own skin, to deny our bond." Lord Percival, recovering from the shock, stepped forward, his face twisted in disgust. "My king, this is madness. She is an Omega of no standing, a vagrant hiding under our roof. This must be a trick of Highland witchcraft. She is the spy. The blood oath exposed her." Cedric didn't even turn his head. "Silence, Percival," he snarled, the alpha command so heavy it forced the chief advisor to his knees. "The stone glows silver. She is pure. She is my mate." "I am no one's mate," Beatrice shouted, the pent-up terror of 5 years finally erupting. Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean paths through the kitchen grime. "I know what you do to Omegas. I have seen the chains. I have seen the breeding rooms. I would rather the Highland rebels take my head than become a captive incubator for the House of Lancaster. I reject this bond." The words hit the hall like a thunderclap. To reject a fated mate was a mythical taboo, an act said to tear the very soul of a Lycan in two. Cedric flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. The feral dominance in his posture fractured, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. But before the king could utter a word to soothe her, the true treason embedded within Dunstanburgh Castle reared its ugly head. "Then let us grant the little Omega her wish," a voice roared from the back of the hall. It was Sir Richard of Trent, the commander of the eastern garrison, and one of Cedric's most trusted generals. He, along with a dozen heavily armed garrison soldiers, drew their broadswords. The gleam of the steel under the torchlight was sickly and dull, coated in liquid wolfsbane and melted silver. The ambush had been meticulously planned. Richard of Trent had sold his loyalty to the Highland rebels, exchanging the crown's secrets for the promise of ruling the Midlands. The blood oath would have exposed him within minutes. But the chaos of the king, finding his hidden mate, provided the perfect, agonizing distraction. "Kill the Iron Wolf," Sir Richard bellowed. "He is weakened by the bond. Strike now!" Chaos erupted. Screams filled the great hall as the unarmed nobility scrambled for the heavy oak doors, the royal guards, momentarily stunned by the mutiny of their own comrades, were slow to draw their weapons. 3 rebel soldiers lunged toward the altar, their silver-coated blades aimed directly at Beatrice, knowing that striking the mate was the fastest way to cripple an alpha. Cedric roared, a sound that transcended human rage and ventured into pure, monstrous fury. He did not shift into his wolf form, there was no time, but his claws elongated, tearing through his leather gauntlets. He threw himself in front of Beatrice, transforming his massive body into an impenetrable shield of flesh and muscle. The sickening sound of tearing flesh echoed over the screams. Beatrice shrieked as a silver-laced blade sank deep into Cedric's shoulder, right where his neck met his collarbone. The king didn't even flinch. With a brutal backhand, he sent the attacker flying across the room, the man's ribs shattering upon impact with a stone pillar. Cedric ripped the poisoned blade from his own shoulder, his black blood sizzling as the silver and wolfsbane burned his veins. He stood over Beatrice, defending the space around the moonstone with a terrifying, bloody savagery. He moved like a demon of war, snapping necks and parrying heavy broadswords with his bare, clawed hands. But the poison was working. The lethal dose of wolfsbane that had entered Cedric's bloodstream was fighting his alpha healing. His movements, usually blindingly fast, began to slow. He dropped to one knee, coughing a splatter of dark blood onto the flagstones, yet he refused to yield the space in front of Beatrice. Sir Richard of Trent stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face, raising a heavy silver executioner's sword. The Iron Wolf dies today, brought low by a scullery maid. Beatrice watched Cedric bleed for her. This ruthless king, a man who could have commanded her, caged her, or broken her, was willingly laying down his life to protect her from a blade meant for her heart. The horrific stories of alpha cruelty that had governed her life suddenly clashed with the reality of the bleeding man kneeling at her feet. She felt the tether, the ancient mystical bond between them, fraying under the weight of his fading heartbeat. No, her inner wolf, fully awakened and surging with ancient Omega magic, refused to let its mate perish. Omegas were not just peacekeepers. In the ancient lore of the first Pax, an awakened Omega was the ultimate anchor, a conduit of the moon goddess's pure power. Beatrice stepped out from behind the altar. She placed her small, calloused hands on Cedric's broad, bleeding back. "Rise, my king," she whispered. It was not a request. It was an Omega command, a blinding shockwave of pure, unadulterated healing energy exploded from Beatrice's palms. The scent of wild orchids intensified until it was a physical force, washing over the great hall. The oppressive, toxic effects of the wolfsbane in Cedric's veins were instantly neutralized. The jagged, silver-burned wound on his shoulder hissed and knit itself together in a matter of seconds. Cedric's eyes snapped open, blazing with a terrifying, renewed golden light. Empowered by the absolute acceptance of his mate, his strength returned tenfold. With a deafening roar, he lunged. The fight lasted less than a minute. Empowered by the bond, Cedric was a force of nature. He shattered Sir Richard's broadsword with a single strike of his clawed hand, before lifting the traitor by the throat and snapping his neck. The remaining mutineers, realizing their lethal poison had been undone and their leader was dead, dropped their weapons in sheer terror, falling to their knees in immediate surrender. Silence once again claimed the blood-stained great hall, save for the crackling of the torches and the groans of the wounded. Cedric stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his clothes shredded and soaked in blood. Slowly, he turned to face Beatrice. The feral rage melted from his posture the moment his eyes locked onto hers. He walked toward her, each step deliberate and slow, as if approaching a frightened deer. He stopped 2 paces away. Then the Iron Wolf of the North, the most feared conqueror in the realm, did the unthinkable. He dropped to his knees, right there in the center of the great hall, surrounded by the surviving lords, ladies, and guards. King Cedric bowed his head, exposing his throat to the scentless servant girl. "You hold my life, Beatrice of the House Aristhorpe," Cedric said, his voice rough with emotion, recognizing her true lineage through the bond. "I swear upon the moonstone and the blood spilled today, you will never wear chains. You will never be caged. You are not my property. You are my equal, my anchor, and my queen. If you wish to leave, I will give you a horse, gold, and safe passage, and I will suffer the agony of a broken bond in silence. But if you stay, I am yours to command." Beatrice looked down at the fearsome warrior kneeling in the blood of his enemies, offering her the one thing she had craved her entire life: a choice. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently lifting his chin so his golden eyes met hers. The fear that had ruled her for 5 years finally dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming warmth. "A king should not kneel in the dirt," Beatrice whispered softly, her thumb brushing a streak of blood from his cheek. Cedric leaned into her touch, a rumble of pure devotion vibrating in his chest. "This king bows only to you." She did not pull away. The scent of wild orchids finally blended perfectly with the sharp, rain-swept pine of his alpha aura, sealing a bond that would forever alter the history of the Northern Highlands. The scentless servant had vanished. In her place stood the true Queen of the North. Did Beatrice's defiance and King Cedric's incredible sacrifice leave you breathless? This medieval werewolf romance proves that true power lies not in dominance, but in absolute devotion and equality. If you loved this dramatic twist of fate, the hidden identities, and the ultimate blood oath reveal, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, heart-pounding werewolf tales. They called her the pack's greatest embarrassment, a wolf who couldn't fight, treating scrapes while warriors bled for glory. But when the invincible Alpha King collapsed, choking on his own black blood, it wasn't a fierce general who stepped up. It was the quiet healer he had publicly humiliated. To understand the legend of the Winterborn Valley, you have to transport yourself back to the deep, unforgiving winters of the early 14th century. The world was dark, borders were drawn in blood, and the werewolf packs of the northern reaches lived by a single, brutal law: only the strong survive. At the apex of this ruthless hierarchy stood Alpha King Gideon. He was a terrifying force of nature, a man who had claimed the throne at 19 after ripping the throat from a tyrant. Standing at 6'4", with eyes the color of a frozen lake and a wolf form that cast a shadow over entire battlefields, Gideon was not a man who believed in mercy. He believed in tooth, claw, and the unmatched regenerative magic of the Lycan bloodline. To Gideon, weakness was not just a flaw, it was a contagion, and in his eyes, No one was more infected than Isolde. Isolde was the pack's designated healer, though the title was largely a joke among the high-born warriors born to a disgraced infantryman. Isolde was afflicted with what the pack called a stunted spirit. Her wolf was unusually small, passive, and completely devoid of bloodlust. While the other females of the pack sparred in the mud and proved their dominance, Isolde spent her days in the dim, herb-draped annex of the castle, grinding yarrow, stitching up omegas, and studying ancient, crumbling medical texts brought over from human lands. She smelled of lavender, sage, and crushed pine, never of iron, never of victory. The true friction between them began on the night of the Blood Moon Feast. The great hall of Castle Winterbourne was a roaring inferno of celebration. Gideon and his elite guard had just returned from a brutal 3-day skirmish with a rogue faction near the western ridges. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar and overflowing goblets of dark ale. The warriors boasted, displaying their wounds like medals. Because of their lichen physiology, most of their slashes were already knitting back together, leaving only angry red scars. Isolde moved quietly along the periphery of the hall, her satchel of tinctures and bandages slung over her shoulder. She was there strictly on duty, checking on the younger warriors who hadn't fully developed their healing abilities. Gideon sat upon his carved oak throne, holding court. At his side was Lord Bram, his hulking beta and most trusted strategist, and Lady Rowena, a fiercely beautiful warrior who had long sought the position of Luna. As Isolde passed the dais, the sharp, metallic tang of corrupted blood caught her sensitive nose. She paused. The scent was coming directly from the Alpha King. Gideon was laughing at a joke Bram had made, but Isolde's eyes locked onto his right forearm. A jagged tear in his leather armor revealed a deep, jagged gash. Unlike the clean wounds of his men, Gideon's injury wasn't sealing properly. The edges were tinged with an unnatural, sickly purple. Against her better judgment, the healer's instinct overrode her self-preservation. Isolde stepped onto the first tier of the dais, bowing her head. "My king," she said, her voice soft but steady beneath the raucous noise of the hall. "Your arm. The wound is infected. Please allow me to clean it and apply a drawing salve." The hall fell dead silent. The music stopped. Every predatory eye turned to the small woman in the simple linen dress. Gideon slowly lowered his goblet, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her, heavy with contempt. He looked at her as if she were a roach that had crawled onto his banquet table. "Infected?" Gideon's voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the stone walls. "I am the Alpha of Winterbourne. My blood burns out impurities before you can even blink, little mouse." "With respect, sire," Isolde persisted, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a jar of black drawing ointment from her satchel. "Rogue claws are often coated in filth. Your lichen healing is trying to close the wound, but it is trapping the corruption inside. If you do not let me extract it—" "Enough!" Bram barked, stepping forward, his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "You dare suggest the king's own body is too weak to heal a simple scratch? You insult him, weed-picker." Lady Rowena let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the silent hall. "Look at her, Gideon. She brings mud and crushed flowers to an alpha. She thinks you are one of the sickly human peasants she fawns over." Gideon stood up, towering over Isolde. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame was suffocating. He extended his bleeding arm, flexing the muscles. Before the eyes of the entire pack, his lichen magic surged. Then sizzled, knitting together in a matter of seconds, sealing the purple rot beneath a layer of fresh, unblemished skin. He smirked, stepping so close to Isolde she had to crane her neck to look at him. "Keep your muddy poultices, healer. A wolf who relies on human weeds is no wolf at all. If you cannot stomach the sight of real warriors, return to your basement with the Omegas." The great hall erupted in thunderous laughter. Warriors slammed their fists on the tables, howling at the humiliation of the quiet healer. Isolde felt her face burn with a deep, humiliating flush. She looked at the sealed skin on his arm, knowing with absolute certainty that he had just signed his own death warrant. But she didn't argue. She knew her place in this brutal society. She bowed her head, packed her satchel, and walked out of the great hall to the sound of jeers. 3 days passed. To the outside world, Castle Winterbourne was impenetrable and strong, preparing for the harsh winter snows. But deep within the stone walls, a silent, lethal shadow had fallen over the Alpha King. It started with a fever. A lichen never caught fevers. But Gideon woke in the middle of the night, his sheets soaked in cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped beast. The skin on his right arm, where the wound had so miraculously healed, was pulsing with a dull, agonizing ache. When he looked at his veins in the candlelight, he realized they were no longer blue. They were pitch black, and the darkness was crawling up his bicep, inching closer to his chest. Gideon's pride was an iron fortress. He told no one. He pushed through the pain, leading patrols and sparring in the courtyard. But his wolf, the majestic, dominant spirit within him, was going rabid. The poison was not just attacking his body, it was attacking his mind. He began to lash out, executing prisoners without trial, violently attacking his own guards in the training ring. Lord Bram was the only one allowed in the king's private chambers. The Beta took control of the daily pack operations, assuring the council that Gideon was simply entering a deep spiritual transition common for alphas coming into greater power. Bram ordered the king's wing sealed. No one was permitted entry. Down in the lower levels, Isolde knew exactly what was happening. On the 4th morning, a young guard named Lord Alistair was carried into her clinic. He had been on the same patrol as Gideon and had suffered a minor bite to the leg. When Isolde cut away Alistair's trousers, she gasped. The man's leg was swollen to twice its size, the veins black and webbed all the way to his groin. He was convulsing, coughing up dark, coagulated blood. "Help me!" Alistair choked, his eyes rolling back. Isolde worked frantically. She cut the wound open, trying to flush it with wolfsbane antidotes, but the moment she made an incision, Alistair's lichen healing violently sealed it shut again. His own body was fighting her treatment. His regenerative abilities had been weaponized. 10 minutes later, Lord Alistair died screaming, his heart exploding in his chest. Isolde stood over his body, covered in his blood, trembling as the horrifying truth locked into place. This was no ordinary rogue infection. This was an engineered, alchemical poison. It was a vile concoction of liquid silver, nightshade, and dark magic. It specifically targeted the lichen healing factor, using the werewolf's rapid cell regeneration to multiply the venom, rushing it directly to the heart. And Gideon had a much higher dose than Alistair. Grabbing her emergency medical kit, a heavy leather bag filled with scalpels, pure silver clamps, and highly toxic herbs that she rarely used. Isolde ran. She sprinted up the spiraling stone staircases, past the armory, straight toward the Alpha's wing. 2 massive guards crossed their halberds as she approached the heavy oak doors. "Halt! No one sees the king." "The king is dying," Isolde shouted, her normally quiet voice cracking like a whip. "Let me through." Before the guards could shove her away, the doors opened. Lord Bram stepped out, his face a mask of cold arrogance. He looked down at the frantic healer, his eyes lingering on the blood staining her apron. "What is the meaning of this screeching?" Bram demanded. "It's a blood curse poison, Lord Bram," Isolde pleaded, stepping forward. "Alistair just died from..." Their healing factor traps the venom and speeds it to the heart. "If Gideon doesn't let me surgically remove the infected tissue and slow his heart rate with hemlock, he will be dead by nightfall." Bram's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, Isolde saw something terrifying in the beta's gaze. It wasn't shock. It wasn't worry. It was calculation. "The Alpha King is fine," Bram said smoothly, stepping out and pulling the doors shut behind him. "His wolf is fighting off a minor sickness. He expressly forbade you from coming near him, Isolde. He'd rather die than be treated by a weakling who plays with weeds." "You're lying," Isolde realized, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Bram, the pieces snapping together. The rogues, the targeted ambush. Bram keeping everyone away. "You want him to die." Bram lunged, grabbing Isolde by the throat and slamming her hard against the stone wall. Her medical bag crashed to the floor. "Listen to me, you worthless little runt," he hissed, his breath hot against her face. "The pack needs a king who can lead us into the new world, not a stubborn relic who refuses to ally with the southern covens. Gideon's time is over. If you speak a word of this to anyone, I will personally rip your weak little wolf from your chest." He dropped her. Isolde hit the floor, gasping for air, clutching her bruised neck as Bram kicked her medical bag down the stairs. "Confine her to the lower wards," Bram ordered the guards. "If she tries to leave, break her legs." But Bram had miscalculated 2 things. He underestimated the sheer, brutal willpower of King Gideon, and he underestimated the courage of a woman who had nothing left to lose. That evening, the pack was summoned to the grand courtyard. Rumors had begun to spread like wildfire. The king had not been seen in days. The rival packs were encroaching on the borders. Panic was setting in. Bram called the assembly, intending to announce that Gideon had fallen into a sacred coma and that he, Bram, would be stepping up as acting alpha. The courtyard was packed with hundreds of werewolves, their breath pluming in the freezing autumn air. Torches cast flickering, demonic shadows against the castle walls. Bram stood on the elevated stone balcony overlooking the masses, raising his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters of Winterborn," he began, projecting his voice. "We face a dark hour. Our king—" A thunderous crash interrupted him. The heavy timber doors of the keep shattered outward, splintering into the courtyard. A collective gasp rippled through the pack as a towering, monstrous silhouette staggered into the torchlight. It was Gideon, but he was a horrific sight. He was shirtless, his heavily muscled torso drenched in black sweat. The black veins now covered half his body, webbing up his neck and creeping up his jawline. His eyes, normally a piercing icy blue, were bloodshot and dilated. He was panting heavily, clutching his chest, but he refused to fall. He had literally battered his way out of his locked chambers, fueled by the primal instinct to protect his pack. "I am your alpha," Gideon roared, though the sound was a wet, ragged tear in his throat. He glared up at Bram, recognizing the betrayal, but the poison had already ravaged his nervous system. He took 2 steps forward, raising a trembling, clawed hand. "I am—" Gideon's eyes rolled back. A horrific, gurgling sound erupted from his chest, and a geyser of thick, black blood spewed from his lips. The invincible Alpha King collapsed like a felled oak, hitting the frozen cobblestones with a sickening thud. He began to convulse violently, his massive body thrashing as his heart went into a lethal overdrive. Total pandemonium erupted. Omegas screamed. Warriors surged forward, but the sheer violently thrashing limbs of the dying Alpha sent them flying back. No one knew what to do. The magic of their blood was useless here. "Stand back!" Bram bellowed from the balcony, drawing his sword and leaping down to the courtyard. "The king is cursed. The poison is contagious. Let his spirit pass." Bram approached the convulsing king, raising his blade, masking his assassination as a mercy killing. "May the moon guide you, my brother." Suddenly, a small, cloaked figure slammed into Bram's side with the force of a battering ram. It wasn't a warrior. It wasn't a massive wolf. It was Isolde. She had escaped the lower wards through the ancient sewage drains, covered in filth, clutching a salvaged leather roll of surgical instruments. She stood between the towering, armed Beta and the dying king, her small chest heaving. "Hai is not dead yet," Isolde screamed, her voice cutting through the panic of the entire pack. She dropped to her knees beside the thrashing giant, pulling a pure silver blade from her kit. Before the entire Winterborn pack, the quiet healer prepared to commit the ultimate heresy. She was going to cut the Alpha King's heart open. The collective gasp that tore through the courtyard was louder than the howling wind. A healer, an omega-blooded, weaponless female, had just drawn silver against the Alpha King. In the laws of the Winterborn pack, touching an alpha with the cursed metal was an act of high treason, punishable by immediate dismemberment. "Treason!" Lord Bram roared, his eyes flashing with a sickening, triumphant glee. He raised his broadsword high, the polished steel catching the torchlight. "Kill the witch. She works with the rogues to assassinate your king." Bram swung the heavy blade down, aiming directly for Isolde's fragile neck. She didn't even flinch, her eyes locked entirely on Gideon's convulsing chest, calculating the exact placement of his heart beneath the slabs of muscle. The killing blow never landed. A deafening clash of metal rang out. Sparks showered over Isolde's shoulders. Commander Griffith, the heavily scarred veteran of the vanguard, had stepped in, his own battle-axe intercepting Bram's sword mere inches from Isolde's head. "Stand down, Bram," Griffith growled, his golden eyes narrowing. "The king is already dying. If this healer thinks she can drag his soul back from the veil, let her try. We have nothing left to lose." "Are you blind, Griffith?" Bram spat, straining against the lock of their weapons. "She holds silver. She is executing him." "If she wanted him dead, she would just stand back and watch," Lady Rowena declared, stepping out from the crowd and drawing her twin daggers. Though she had mocked Isolde days ago, her loyalty to the true Alpha superseded her pride. She flanked the healer. "Let the mouse work. Anyone who interrupts her will answer to my blades." A tense, electric silence fell over the courtyard. The warriors formed a protective ring around the dying king and the kneeling healer, locking Bram out. Isolde's hands were remarkably steady. The fear that usually governed her life had completely evaporated, replaced by the cold, precise focus of a surgeon. She looked down at Gideon. His chest was violently shuddering, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. The black veins were pulsing, converging directly over his heart. "Forgive me, my king," she whispered. With a swift, brutal motion, Isolde pressed the pure silver scalpel into Gideon's chest. Gideon's eyes snapped wide open, flashing a blinding, monstrous red. A roar of pure, unadulterated agony tore from his throat, shaking the very foundations of the castle. The silver hissed wildly as it cut through his flesh, burning the tissue. Thick white smoke plumed from the incision, smelling of seared meat and ozone. The pack wailed, many falling to their knees and covering their ears, their instincts screaming at the scent of burning silver. The silver was necessary, Isolde knew. If she used a regular steel blade, Gideon's rampant lichen healing factor would seal the flesh the second she removed the blade, trapping her instruments and the poison inside. The silver cauterized the edges, keeping the wound forcibly open. "Hold him down!" Isolde screamed to Commander Griffith. "If he thrashes, I will pierce his lung." Griffith and 3 massive vanguard warriors threw their weight onto Gideon's limbs, pinning the thrashing alpha to the frozen cobblestones. Isolde plunged her hands into the steaming, open chest cavity. The heat radiating from his core was enough to blister her skin, but she ignored the pain. Her fingers slipped through blood and muscle until she felt it. Above his rapidly fibrillating heart, a swollen black cyst had formed within the major artery. It was the epicenter of the alchemical poison, feeding off his accelerated blood flow and pumping liquid death through his system. "I need hemlock extract and the silver clamps, now," Isolde ordered, her voice cutting through the panic. She clamped the artery, momentarily stopping the blood flow to the king's heart. Gideon's body seized violently one last time, and then he went completely limp. His chest stopped moving. The red light faded from his eyes. "He's dead," someone whispered from the crowd. Bram laughed, a dark, venomous sound. "You let a weed picker murder your king." "Shut up!" Isolde snapped. Her hands moved in a blur. She cleanly excised the black, pulsing cyst, throwing it onto the stones where it sizzled and melted the frost like acid. She immediately poured a vial of crushed hemlock and rare moonflower directly into the open cavity. The hemlock drastically slowed his heart rate, preventing the remaining traces of venom from multiplying, while the moonflower neutralized the alchemical rot. But his heart was still stopped. Isolde pulled the silver clamps away and tossed the scalpel aside. She pressed both her blood-soaked hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. She closed her eyes and tapped into the one thing the pack mocked her for, her stunted, gentle wolf spirit. It wasn't meant for killing. It was pure, unadulterated life force. "Breathe," she commanded, sending a massive shockwave of her own spiritual energy directly into his chest. She slammed her fists down on his sternum. Thump. "Nothing." "Isolde," Griffith murmured, his voice thick with grief. "It's over." "No!" Isolde screamed, tears mixing with the soot on her face. She slammed her fists down again, funneling every ounce of her soul's warmth into his cold body. "You are the Alpha of Winterborn. You do not yield to poison. Breathe!" Thump. The sound was like a cannon firing in the silent courtyard. Gideon's massive chest suddenly hitched. He violently arched his back off the cobblestones, inhaling a massive, shuddering breath of freezing air. The black veins on his neck instantly began to recede, turning back to a healthy, vibrant blue, then fading entirely beneath his skin. Without the silver holding the wound open, his natural lichen healing roared back to life. The massive incision on his chest sizzled, knitting together in seconds, leaving behind only a jagged, silvery scar, a permanent testament to the night his life was saved by a blade. Gideon fell back against the stones, panting heavily, his skin flushed with returning heat. His icy blue eyes blinked open, clear and lucid. He slowly turned his head, his gaze falling upon the small, trembling woman, kneeling in a pool of his blood. Isolde slumped backward, completely, physically, and magically exhausted. She looked at him, gave a weak, relieved smile, and passed out cold on the frozen ground. When Isolde awoke, she was not in the damp, drafty annex of the lower wards. She was enveloped in silk sheets, surrounded by the scent of cedar and wood smoke. A massive fire roared in a stone hearth. She slowly sat up, her head throbbing, realizing with a jolt that she was in the Alpha King's private chambers. "You slept for 2 full days," a deep, gravelly voice rumbled from the shadows. Isolde gasped, pulling the velvet quilt up to her chin. Gideon stepped into the light of the fire. He wore only a loose pair of linen trousers, his broad chest bare, showcasing the new, vicious scar resting directly over his heart. He looked exhausted, yet incredibly powerful. "My king," she stammered, immediately trying to climb out of the bed to kneel. "I should not be here. Forgive me." "Stop," Gideon commanded softly. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the mattress, his massive weight causing the bed to dip. For the first time in his life, the invincible Alpha looked unsure of himself. He stared at her, his icy eyes stripped of their usual arrogance, replaced by a heavy, profound vulnerability. "Bram confessed," Gideon said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Under Commander Griffith, interrogation," he admitted to orchestrating the ambush. He laced the rogue's claws with alchemical poison. He locked me away, so I would die quietly, leaving the throne to him. Gideon reached out, his massive, calloused hand hovering awkwardly before he gently touched the dark, purple bruises still marking Isolde's neck. The bruises Bram had given her when he choked her. Gideon's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. "He has been executed," Gideon stated coldly. "His head is on a spike at the valley borders." Isolde swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. "I am sorry for your betrayal, sire." "You warned me," Gideon whispered, forcing her to look at him. "In the great hall, in front of everyone. You saw the rot inside me, and you tried to heal it. And in return, I humiliated you. I called you weak." He slid off the bed, lowering his towering frame until his knees hit the floor. The Alpha King, a man who bowed to no gods and no kings, was kneeling beside her bed. "Gideon, please," Isolde panicked. "You don't have to." "I owe you my life," he interrupted, his voice thick with raw emotion. "My strength, my claws, my magic, everything that made me superior, was exactly what the poison used to kill me. My pride blinded me. I thought a warrior's worth was measured in the blood they spill. But you You walked into a courtyard of armed killers, completely defenseless, and ripped death from my chest with your bare hands. He took her small, trembling hand in his large one, pressing his lips to her knuckles. The spark that passed between their skin made Isolde gasp. It was the mate bond, long buried beneath his arrogance and her fear, suddenly roaring to life. "You are the strongest wolf in this pack, Isolde," Gideon vowed, looking up at her with fierce devotion. "I was a fool. I beg for your forgiveness, and I beg for the honor of standing by your side." The transition of Winterborn was absolute. A week later, the great hall was filled once again. The banners were raised, the fires roared, and the pack was assembled. But the hierarchy had shifted forever. When the heavy oak doors opened, Alpha King Gideon entered, but he did not walk alone. Beside him walked Isolde. She no longer wore the simple, muddy linen of a servant. She was draped in rich, deep emerald velvets, a cloak of white winter fox fur resting on her shoulders. Around her neck hung a delicate chain holding a single, melted piece of silver, the scalpel that had saved the king. The warriors who had once mocked her now dropped to one knee as she passed, bowing their heads in profound, genuine reverence. Lady Rowena stood at the front of the dais, lowering her weapons in respect. Commander Griffith slammed his fist over his heart in salute. Gideon led Isolde up the steps to the dais. He didn't guide her to a seat beside his throne. He had a new throne carved, equal in height and grandeur, right next to his own. He turned to his people, taking her hand. "For generations, Winterborn has survived on the sharpness of our claws," Gideon's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls. "But survival is not enough. To truly live, to thrive, we need more than killers. We need healers. We need the courage to face our own weaknesses." He looked down at Isolde, his icy eyes melting with a warmth she had never thought possible. "Behold your Luna," Gideon declared. "The savior of Winterborn, the heart of the pack." The great hall erupted. It was not the mocking laughter of the past, but a deafening, thunderous roar of approval. The wolves howled, their voices vibrating through the very stones of the castle, welcoming their new queen. Isolde looked out at the fierce warriors, then up at the giant of a man who held her hand like she was his most precious treasure. She had never been a fighter, but she had fought for him, and in doing so, she had conquered the most dangerous alpha in the northern reaches, not with a sword, but with a silver blade and an unyielding heart. What an incredible tale of courage, pride, and the ultimate redemption. Isolde proved that true strength isn't always about muscle and fangs. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to save those who wronged you. Did Gideon's transformation and their unexpected romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this dramatic werewolf saga, smash that like button, share it with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding stories every week.